Okay. Well, welcome everyone. This is the second of two sessions that are kind of on a joint project that we're working on, kind of addressing initially the House Bill 1159 that came out and the resulting state statute, but getting way beyond that at this point, and that's what we're going to show you today. We're moving beyond just looking at the impact of the law on our cities and counties and looking at urban forestry for the state as a whole. Today, I'm joined with Rob Northrop. Rob Northrop is the urban forester for Hillsborough County here in the Tampa Bay area. I am at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center, I being Andrew Koeser. As I'm an associate professor there in the Environmental Horticulture Department. Rob will lead today. He'll be giving an introduction, about 10 minutes, about urban forestry and kind of some of the broader planning and adaptive management that we can kind of roll in with some of this information we're going to be giving you. I'll talk a little bit about a recap of what we did last session, then go right into the Canopy analysis that we're in the midst of at the moment, and give you a little sneak peek. And I see a lot of you, I've snuck in some data for your city, so you'll have something to look forward to. Got a pre-notice of the list. When you have questions, please use the question and answer session. There's an option at the bottom. There is just put your questions in there, and then when we get to the end of our presentations, we'll go through them and kind of pick out some questions to talk to. And if you have more, just keep filing them in as we talk at the end of the program. Also, you chat all you want, chats amongst yourselves. The chat option will not be recorded, even though the whole talk is recorded. So you're free to be snarky or whatever you want to do. If you don't like what I say, go for it. But yeah, we will not be recording that. We will record this presentation. So if you have folks at work or in your community that you want to show this to, and they're not able to make it today, they will have that option later next week. So with that, Rob, if you want to take it away and get us started.
Sure. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about the future of urban forest management, particularly in Florida, but I think this pertains to other parts of the world also. You notice I have urban in parentheses in forest management because they're beginning to meld together. So, today urban forest management is often defined as the art, science, and technology of managing trees in and around urban environments for psychological, sociological, economic, and aesthetic benefits that trees provide to society. But there are changes occurring, and an urban ecological conversation concerning municipal and urbanizing forests has now begun in earnest. Up on your screen here, you can see some place-based research that we conducted about 13 years ago in conjunction with EPA. And we looked at the forests, that is the entire forest system, what we might consider municipal forests and woodlands in what ex-urban and peri-urban, that is suburban and more rural areas in totality for the Tampa Bay watershed. And you can see that what we found out was that given all these different types of land uses and ecological systems, that forests actually played the biggest role, the most significant role in producing the ecosystem goods and services that society requires to maintain itself. So this is the ecological conversation that's beginning to occur as we begin to look at the forest as a complete entire community, both inside municipal boundaries and outside within different land uses, but also beginning to look at the trees and all of the plants, the soils, the functioning of the hydrology, and the animal associations, and the social element, our society, all together, and looking at those relationships. And in particular, right now, we are being very conscious of the relationships between the forest and these goods and services that are produced. Here in Florida, we have a large part to play in how it will be actualized, and probably in other parts of the world too, through planning and management of our urbanizing forests. And this is something that Andrew is going to talk a little bit about. And that will take some knowledge, skill, and courage, and a great deal of humility to begin to approach the entirety of the peninsula, at least of Florida, as an urbanizing forest in which urban forest management has a very significant role. We now have an opportunity here to affect what will be available to future generations and how it'll be managed. Florida is one of 36 global hotspots for biological diversity. That is the diversity of life, not only species, but the diversity of habitats and the diversity of different forms of communities of plants and animals. It's a hotspot also because in this area, we are losing so much of that biological diversity. But one of the things to keep in mind is that we are one of those 36 hotspots globally. So that is what we do here has a direct influence on the biological diversity of the entire global system. Now, between 2010 and 2060, 7 million acres will be converted from farm, ranch, and native habitat to urban lands. That's about 1/5 of the total surface area of Florida. 2 million acres of this will be developed within 1 mile of public conservation land. We're going to get about 18 million new residents. That doubles the population. What does the future hold for Florida's fish, wildlife, and forests? Well, that's really up to us to decide and how we're going to approach this. We can begin to see the peninsula, at least of Florida, as being these forest habitat patches swimming in a sea of urbanization. That means that the forests of Florida are now going to become embedded into an urban land matrix, and that urban forestry now becomes a key part in the maintenance of not only trees and shrubs and street trees and parks within municipal boundaries, but becomes a critical and significant part of how we conserve the entire diversity of life on the peninsula, and keeping in mind that that diversity makes up the ecological systems that ultimately produce the goods and services that society requires. Now on your screen right now is an example of the development style often found in West Central Florida. This style, of course, is the first step in urbanization. This is not the final step. This is just the first step in taking rural lands and converting them into urban zones, dense populations, high and significant levels of impervious surface, which then affect the flow of energy, of plants, of animals, and the hydrology for the entire region. To the bottom of your screen, what you're looking at is what is commonly called around here a forest preserve. That land itself was purchased, it's about 3,000 acres, just to let you know, was purchased as an aquifer recharge area because it has a significant connect to the aquifers that exist below our area, for which we use for water for various uses, agriculture, urban and residential, and industrial. These same sets of policies and principles for land use planning that designed the urban zone you see above also created this preserve. but you notice that there is a stark difference between the two land use types. And this is based upon the misconception that we've had for many years about ecosystems, about that there's a balance in nature, that you can have a preserve, that the piece below is not affected by the piece above on your screen, that the piece below is closed and self-regulating, okay? And that humans are not necessarily components of that part. This is not a contemporary understanding of ecological systems, and it leads us to some very erroneous decisions about how we manage this urbanizing forest that we live in Florida. And remember, this urbanizing forest is one of those 36 global hotspots for biological diversity. Of course, we're coming to recognize that change is inevitable, and that change is not inevitable. That change is exactly what's going on all the time, because all of us are now beginning to deal with climate change. And we're dealing with that in our cities, and we're dealing with that in our countrysides. To ensure the future of our forests and the needed goods and services that they provide, urban forest management has to shift from simply looking at trees to considering the management of trees, woodlands, fragments of forests in those suburban areas, and forests themselves within the entire metropolitan ecosystems that are beginning to develop. Remember that quote from the Fish and Wildlife Commission in 2010, forest patches swimming in a sea of urbanization. That means that the forest itself is going to be surrounded by and included in the urban areas that are beginning to develop today. And that means that urban forest management will no longer be the realm of just one discipline, but will be interdisciplinary in nature. That means there's a whole lot of uncertainty, right? We've got, the emergence of urban forestry as a discipline is obviously a response to rapid population growth, not only here in Florida, but across the United States and across the entire world, and the subsequent expansion of cities into metropolitan regions. And in our case, into a metropolitan region that appears to be likely to incorporate all or most of the peninsula of Florida. This context is unprecedented, and there are many uncertainties. But first, we can use ecological science as a touchstone in guiding the development and implementation of a more comprehensive and interdisciplinary form of urban forestry. And second, we need to do a much better job of monitoring our conservation actions. Long-term monitoring, defensible relationships between our management actions and outcomes have to be demonstrated and documented. We have to identify significant trends in the forest. Not only is canopy, and Andrew's going to talk a good bit about that, but also its distribution, the structure of the forest, its composition. All of these things will matter in the long run as we begin to mature in this discipline of urban forestry. This long-term monitoring then allows us to adjust technical practices and management actions over time. We have to become a learning discipline, and the agencies we work with have to become learning institutions. We need to be changed over time, both in the biophysical environment, and we need to monitor and expect change of the expectations of the residents who in fact guide our actions. Few activities are more important to the success of management as monitoring. But the steps often overlooked, poorly designed, and often underfunded or not funded at all. We need to participate. We need to participate fully within the ecological science of urban forest management. we need to approach urban forest management more rigorously, much in the way that science and business approach their activities today, by continually testing what we do, monitoring what we do, and making adjustments to our practices so that we continually work our way towards what society expects as a goal or a vision, the future desired condition of the urban and urbanizing forest of the state of Florida. And finally, and importantly, because this is such a new discipline, and because there is so much to learn and share, we need to share our knowledge. We need to do it all the time, as often as possible. It doesn't have to be webinars like this. It doesn't have to be people like Andrew and I who are expected to be academically inclined and scientists, because we all know that there is a tremendous amount of knowledge that is gained and is accruing by the people who are actually on the ground doing the work. Small groups of people working together in working groups, like we have here in West Central Florida, we have a West Central Urban Forest Working Group, are critical to sharing very practical and important information. Now, this image is, in fact, I believe, what we are likely to see occur during the next 40 years, if land use practices remain the same. And I hope they don't, but if they do, this is kind of what we're going to be looking at. And we're going to find that the forest's ability to produce the goods and services required by society within our growing metropolitan regions is going to be constrained by fragmentation, the breaking up of the forest, the loss of that critical diversity, loss of plants, animals that are critical to maintain the functioning of our forest ecosystems to produce the goods and services, and those structural elements, you know, and the continual disruption of ecosystem processes by engineered urban infrastructure. It's in this context in which the discipline of urban forest management needs to bring an orderly and efficient approach to forest establishment and maintenance. Urban forest management approaches that will be needed will include passive types of management, unmanaged natural area reserves. We can already see this in numerous of our bigger metropolitan regions right now. Low impact forms of urban forest management close to nature. We can see this, I know, here in the Tampa Bay as we watch the Natural Areas program here attempt to use fire every 3 years to help to regenerate and maintain the plant and animal diversity on their nature reserves. But we're also going to begin to see medium forms of combined objective forestry. That is, we're going to see within our urban areas the use of silviculture to manage those bigger blocks, those bigger forest patches that are swimming in that urban matrix. Urban forestry will become and is becoming incorporated in and inclusive with silviculture and traditional forms of forestry. And because of the nature of the urban matrix that is occurring and is emerging, we are also going to see intensive short rotation forestry right within our urban areas, the production of fiber. And finally, and not the least important, of course, is what we've all considered to be urban forestry up until this point, and that is municipal and residential arboriculture. Still a key component of urban forestry. The mix of management approaches used and what's chosen will influence the balance between the economic, the ecological, and the social dimensions of sustainability. Urban forestry is a conversation between the social values of society and the biophysical world. It is hard. It is a new context. It will be difficult for us, but it is a rewarding dialogue. It is a necessary dialogue. and it is the focal point of contemporary urban forestry disciplines. The goal of urban forest management is the sustainability of the ecological processes that produce resources, beauty, and all the rest. In a forest landscape like Florida, it is the future. In the long run, this cannot be achieved through piecemeal and isolated approaches to planning and management. It will require cooperation and collaboration, not only between municipal governments and counties, but between municipal governments, counties, state governments, nonprofits, private organizations, private consultants, and the general public. This will require an unprecedented change in the way we approach urban forestry. For in Florida, urban forestry is the future of forestry. Andrew is about to show you some work that's been going on down here that I believe is the first step in doing this. I believe that what Andrew is about to show you is the beginning of a more robust and comprehensive future for urban forestry in the state of Florida. Thanks a bunch.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I just want to start out by the topic of today is urban tree canopy in Florida, and we'll be talking about the current status as we've measured it, its associated benefits in three key ecosystem services, and then we'll talk a little bit about threats, mostly just one in particular. So this work was funded through the Florida Forest Service. So Will, if you're online, thank you again for noting the potential of this project. Again, Clue, Emily, and Michael, thank you for matching the funds to make sure that this happened. And I hope that when you're done, you'll see that this is a project that you can all benefit from and actually use in your practice to guide your decisions in the future. I want to start, so Tampa's on my mind because we're about to start talking about the next cycle of our ecosystem assessment that we do every 5 years with the city, something that's a partnership between Tampa, USF, and then University of Florida. And this gets to what Rob was talking about. In this assessment, we look at more than just the canopy. We look at the structure and the diversity of species and its distribution in our urban areas. In Tampa, in this case, this is something that is part of the city's urban forestry management plan, something that University of Florida helped them write and has worked on in other cities. So that is out there for you if we're willing to help in whatever manner we can to help you advance urban forestry in your own community. I love this picture. This is Seth Blair, a past grad student in my lab. This is, I think, his first week from West Virginia, and he did not know what he was getting into when he was getting into an iTree eco assessment of Tampa. I think he walked over a pygmy rattlesnake and went past some croaking alligators on his way to that plot center, and he's reconsidering all of his life choices at this moment. But this is just one of 200 plus plots randomly located throughout the city of Tampa to assess their urban forest. In conjunction, they do a canopy analysis. And the thing that, in addition to giving you, the city, information on the management of your urban asset, your forest covered asset, this kind of analysis gets you some good press. This is something that was picked up by National Geographic, 9 cities that love their trees. Tampa has 32% tree cover. You'll see that is on the higher end, but there are other cities, some of you out there have more canopy coverage in your cities than this, and we now know this. And then it leads to other people taking interest in doing their own research. This is a study out of MIT where they looked at Google Street View images, and they calculated what percent of that image was green area. And Tampa was the world leader, benefiting from evergreen trees, or mostly evergreen species, and low trees that fit into the view of Google Street View. We won. And that was picked up, this story was picked up by colleagues of mine in Auckland, New Zealand, and Europe. So, when you do this kind of monitoring, it benefits you internally, and then it can actually, the other people will pick up on that, and it'll open up opportunities. And we hope that is the case with what we've done for you. When you do this type of analyses over time, Tampa's now done their ecosystem assessment over 3 periods. They're starting their 4th. You can actually see trends. And those trends are the feedback that you need to show whether or not your policies and procedures and your management actions are meeting their mark or not meeting their mark. Tampa, they have a no net loss goal for their canopy coverage, despite the growth that they're, in addition to the growth that they're experiencing. So if you can see here the figure with the 3 bar charts, you can see over the 3 years that this canopy was assessed for Tampa, they had no net canopy loss. You see little rises in the data, but those, we can't distinguish those from real changes or from error in the methodology. So statistically speaking, there was no change over the assessment period. And when you have this data and you have this information, you can go to your superiors and your elected officials and say, we can have growth and trees at the same time. And this title for this article does not capture some of the stress and the dialogue that occurred to get to this point, but Tampa did reach the point where they actually created a new preservation ordinance based on science that was a compromise between the builders and those who valued the trees in their city. Unfortunately, this is where we step in with this project that was ultimately upended, and we gave a lot of reasons for this in our last talk. It came down to Florida had a lot of protections in place, more than most places in the world. Florida also had more growth than most places in the world, and those 2 things came to a head, and the state passed this law right here. This is House Bill 1159, now Florida Statute 163045, which just for I know most of you know this, but I'm just gonna, if anyone's new on the call, essentially says a local government may not require notice of application, approval, permit, fee, or mitigation for the pruning, trimming, or removal of a tree on residential property if the property owner obtains documentation from an arborist certified by ISA or licensed as a landscape architect that says that the tree is a danger. And we mentioned in the last call that there were many definitions in here that were vague and problematic. The one thing that they were very clear about in this law was that they wanted to reduce or essentially remove local oversight of trees on private residential property. And if you were on our first call way back when, we had Jeff Van Treese, who was a former grad student of mine. He's a Juris Doctorate. He's a lawyer and a PhD interested in urban forestry and environmental horticulture. And he explained to us that this essentially exceeds the standard for documentation given the new law. He said you could pretty much draw a picture of a tree. I made this picture for a talk I gave in the UK, and I wanted to share it with you because it was my artistic skills put to a test. But it also captures a fear that we have. So people are afraid of trees, and as urban foresters who care about trees and folks who manage urban trees, we were worried about the fear of trees and what that. Now that's not a beer, that's coffee. Thanks, James. But yeah, so we were afraid that the undue fear that people have of trees would lead to the removal of trees in mass quantities. It looks more like development is probably the bigger fear for us given the new law, but we'll show that in a little bit. So to address this new statute, and again, we've expanded since then, we came up with a 2-part plan to kind of bring research to the problem and see if the fears that people were having over the loss of canopy were met with reality. So the first part is what we gave last session, and that was an assessment of existing ordinances in the 300 largest cities in the state. I picked cities. Honestly, I don't know why I did. I think counties would have been also good to include, and in hindsight, I would have done that. But we wanted to get a sense of the scope of what was occurring and how much this law was going to upend local governance. And, as part of this, we mined Muni Code, we did surveys to see how we were changing things, and those results are in our last presentation. What we're going to show you today is how we're going to be pairing this information with a canopy assessment to see what the effect of the new law is on our urban forests. When we, in our last session, we said that we were looking at a couple key ordinances that we thought would impact urban tree canopy. And then all the ordinances that have eyes behind them, we think the new law can potentially impact them. So we wanted to look at ordinances that we thought directly related to canopy coverage, which would be the regulation and removal of dead and diseased trees, the requirement of preservation during development, new planting during development of parking lots and housing lots and commercial lots, restriction of tree cutting on private property, and the identification and protection of heritage or otherwise significant trees. And then as kind of a side note to this, we also wanted to look at laws that were on the books for enforcement, because it's one thing to have an ordinance in place, but there's research out there that half the cities in Canada that have ordinances in place to protect trees don't actually enforce them. So what is that enforcement like? Are there even provisions in place to allow cities to require licensing for tree care firms, or to have penalties or fines for noncompliance of the ordinances listed above? Because that's going to really kind of make a difference on whether or not these ordinances had any teeth to begin with. And as we showed in the last presentation, there was widespread adoption of these ordinances in Florida, more so than anywhere else in the United States. The one ordinance that's probably the most significant with regard to the new statute and how it's going to be impacted is ordinances that restrict the cutting of trees on private property. And nearly half of the cities that we surveyed, of the top 300, had these ordinances in place prior to 163.045. More common, and maybe, and probably just as likely to be influenced, but maybe not to the same degree, were ordinances that regulated the removal of dead and diseased trees, and ordinances that required preservations of trees during development. These kind of go towards more of the mitigation aspect of the law. And if people are using the law as a means of getting around protections during development, you may not have, the mitigation that you would have at the, prior to this. And then one that's we're going to highlight a couple times in the talk today is the identification of heritage or otherwise significant trees. And 70% of the cities that we surveyed and mined in Unicode and other places had these ordinances on their books. So before the law was even in place, while it was still, like, after it had been rejected the first time and it was still kind of a ghost in the background ready to lurk again, we decided that we were going to see what effect do these ordinances actually have. Do they even do anything in the first place? And if they do, can we assess that remotely and see what that impact is? And you can see here, this is a picture of 3 or 4 of my girls, I don't know where the 4th is, probably climbing in the tree, around a large heritage tree in Ybor in Tampa. And this is a tree that is under protections, that is in the sites of a developer, but the city has protected it. And these are the trees that are that we need to protect, given their outsized influence on ecosystem services. So I said before, we did multiple assessments of, both on the ground and in the air. For this study, we decided to go with an aerial assessment because you can get a lot of data quickly and relatively efficiently and move through a variety of cities. When Sean Landry at USF does his assessments of canopies, he uses, LiDAR or photogrammetric data to put elevation in there and automatically determine what are trees and what are non-trees. And then when he does that, he can, slice and dice the city in many different ways. We are nowhere near sophisticated in our research. We do, if any of you had forestry or some land surveying work in college, and you put acetate over a map or an aerial photo with dots, that's kind of what we're doing with digital help, in this study. But it's very effective, it's very resilient, and it's prone to less error than automatic means. And we count palms as trees. We call anything with an elevated canopy as a tree in our assessments for that question that popped up in the chat. So one thing that you can do, and we'll show you this in a little bit, is do eye-tree canopy. And that's a really easy and straightforward way of doing a canopy assessment in your own community, for your own campus, for whatever, We did not use that for our studies because we wanted to select the age of the images that we were using, They default to the most recent images, but if you don't care what age the imagery is, if you just want the most current, which is what most people want, this is a very straightforward way, and they have boundaries already loaded in there. You don't even have to load your own. I did one recently for my daughter for a school project, and I didn't have to upload anything. So, and the reason we do this is something that Sean illustrated in a report, is that imagery gets better and better over time. It gets more higher resolution and cheaper for that resolution as we do these analyses over time. And this different resolution can really wreak havoc on a computer trying to automatically detect canopy. Whereas we can see we can tell what is a bleacher and what is the field at Raymond James in these pictures. In all cases, we can start to even pick out things like the numbers on the field as we get to, like 1 foot per pixel in 2011. And then it gets really crisp and clear. And you can actually see people in the stands in the most recent imagery. And this is something that our eyes and our minds can just work around in a way that even some of the more complex machine learning algorithms can't at this point. That'll be for the future. So for this initial study, we looked at 41 cities that had completed this massive survey that Rich Hauer from Stevens Point had put together. And these are the cities in the map above or to the left. And we were interested in just pulling out bits and pieces from the survey data to see what predicted canopy coverage in our urban areas in Florida, in our cities. You can see here our canopies ranged from around 18%, mostly in the southeast, to some higher levels of canopy in the central and to the state. And things that we looked at were, housing density, the median home value, which relates to the size, how many houses were built in the last 10, 20, 30 years, because when you do bare earth kind of development, you got to restart your canopy from scratch in many places, right? Do cities have ISA certified arborists on staff? Do they have 4-year degrees? Folks do they have tree boards? And then do they have various ordinances in place, such as a preservation ordinance, a removal permit ordinance, a heritage tree ordinance? Do they have canopy goals? And do they have tree inventories? Trying to see what predicted canopy. As I said here, we had a range of canopies. Deerfield, in this study of 41 cities, Deerfield Beach was our lowest canopy. Anything on the coast is going to have lower canopy just because of the value of the property, right? You're just going to build up. and as dense as you can. So Deerfield Beach had 17.6%. Gainesville, Florida had 63.3%. That is not the best in the state, actually. You'll see there's some cities actually have more. And when you have large canopies in the 60s and so in the high 50s, assume that they have just annexed or they have some natural preserves as part of their city boundaries. So, and that's going to be a challenge going forward in this project. This is a cool little figure. It's a little blurry. I apologize for this, but what we did is we ran a bunch of different models, just hundreds of different iterations of models to see what predictor variables were true, were like significant predictors of canopy coverage. And you can see here the black bands, the bigger the black band is, the more significant it is, essentially. So our intercept, which is just a statistical thing, is always in there. Housing density came up as one of the most significant, and the next most significant thing was heritage tree ordinances. Interestingly, in several iterations of this, the presence of a certified arborist was a significant predictor of canopy, but it was a significant predictor of canopy loss. So, and it took a while to get our head around this, but essentially certified arborists are where there are people, and where there are people, there tend to be fewer trees, right? So it's kind of an inverse relationship in that regard. Our more densely populated areas tended to have more certified arborists. So, in the end, when we kind of simplified our models to the basic, when you do model building, you want to tell the most of the biggest part of the story with the least amount of variables to make it as straightforward and parsimonious, we like to say, as possible. And in doing so, it came down to housing density and heritage tree ordinances. As cities get more dense, they have fewer trees, obviously. That's kind of just a check on reality for this model. But then we also found that heritage tree ordinances increased canopy coverage by nearly 7% on average when you control for density. So if a city is as dense as another city, two cities in the center of the state, if they're as dense as each other, the one with the heritage tree ordinance will have 7% more canopy, which is a big deal when you're going from 18 to 60 some percent, right? That's bigger than the normal 7% that you're thinking about. And why does that matter? Here's my hypothesis. We get the numbers as scientists, and then we have to interpret what those numbers mean. And we can get this wrong. But in my thoughts, I would say that cities with higher, with bigger trees have more canopy because those bigger trees are having outsized influence. And this is the data that I used to support it. This is from our assessment of Tampa. We see live oak and laurel oak, the biggest species that they have in the city, are less than 10% of the trees, but nearly a third of their canopy, right? So, and then things like black mangrove, which are just super abundant along the coast, and Brazilian pepper and white mangrove, by stem count, they're all over the place, but they have a very minimal impact on canopy coverage because they're small stature trees. So, but if you're interested in this work, it is published in Landscape and Urban Planning. The link below, if you want to take a screen grab or take a quick picture, will take you to a free version of this because Lara Roman from the Forest Service was on it, and anytime someone from the Forest Service is on a paper, it gets past the paywall, which is nice. So, so to this current project, which is the one we're talking about now, and that we are, I'd say, 3/4 of the way through, we want to do that same study and that same assessment that we did with 41 cities, but now expand it, try to get more of a reach in the state. So what we want to do is figure out what were the canopy conditions in 2018, right before House Bill 1159 became Florida Statute 163.045. What were the conditions that year and the months leading up to the passage of that law and before hurricane season hit? And then we want to see, kind of like we did with the last paper, can we predict, given the current status of the urban forest, whether or not ordinances had an impact on this larger population of cities? Does that same pattern that we saw with the 41 cities hold true when we get to more cities? And then this is going to take time, but we now have, with this assessment, we now have our base level assessment of canopy in the entire state. And as the years pass, we can see how does canopy change over time. Does it increase? We hope so. Does it decrease? We hope not. Does it stay the same? That'd be great. Does the law have an impact or not? Because a lot of people are fearful of the law. Some people dismiss its importance. Let's get some numbers to that and have a real conversation, you know? And then if loss occurs, here's a kicker, right? If loss occurs and it occurs disproportionately in the cities that had the strictest ordinances in place, so the ones that were more laissez-faire, things kind of stayed the same, but the ones that had ordinances in places, there's losing trees at a higher rate than the others. We know to some degree of certainty that the law had an impact, right? And I'll show you all the things that we're going to kind of control for to make sure that we're getting that right. So the idea for this, you know, I rarely have any ideas on my own. I just kind of look at what's out there and kind of modify them. But Wisconsin has done this already. And they're the first state that has kind of a statewide urban tree canopy assessment. And I'm from Wisconsin, so of course that's why I knew it. And I have friends that are still active in urban forestry there. And I thought, you know, if it's, you know, we're 4 times the state in population that Wisconsin is, we can be able to fund something similar and give the cities of Florida some of the same data that is open to the cities and villages in Wisconsin. And, oops. So here we are. We're looking at aerial images a little closer than from the space shuttle of Florida, and we had a crew during COVID self-isolation, brought some computers home with the graces of the university, and just clicked on a bunch of dots, just thousands and thousands of dots, and they made really good time going through and assessing canopy in the cities of Florida. I made this picture. I'm pretty happy with this one. I love graphs, unfortunately for you. This is a distribution of canopy throughout the state. And what you can see here is the black solid line towards the middle of this curve. It's not a normal curve. There's kind of a skew towards the lower side, or actually a skew towards the higher side, where there's a couple cities that are kind of bringing things off to the right. But you can see here that the median, or the middle of our curve, is 32.3%. So if your city has less than 32.3% canopy coverage, you're with the bottom half of the population. And that's not a bad thing. You know, that's just the reality. These are numbers, right? And if you are above 32.3%, you're in the top half of the population. And I made a 25% mark at, you know, 24% actually, just worked out pretty close. And then the 75th percentile, the 75% mark, is at 42.6%. So, and we can even go to the top, you can go to the 10th percentile if you really want to know if you're in the top 90, you know, things like that. But you can see here that the most common kind of, you know, thing nearly, you know, there's a kind of a big hump between the second and the first and the second quartile, between the 24% and the 32%. When we looked at the entire population of those 300 largest cities, and we went from essentially Jacksonville to Sneads. So if your city has the population higher than 2,700 or lower than 900,000, you're in this, okay? And so the highest canopy coverage when we expanded our study was Sanibel with 68.7% canopy. You will notice that Sanibel, as I alluded to before, benefits from the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge being in their jurisdiction. So this is going to be something that we have to correct for when we assess the impacts of the new ordinance, right? We can't, because that's going to skew our results if you have a wildlife refuge that was not covered by this new law. giving you an outsized influence on your canopy coverage measurements. But good, congrats to anyone from Sanibel. The lowest canopy coverage was Reddington Shores. And again, this is a coastal city. You know, this is on a barrier island in Pinellas County, and it's probably actually a lot of reclaimed land from the sea on those canals and fingers, and it's really valuable. So when you have valuable land, houses take precedence in our development practices today. So Reddington Shores, you have 5.9%. Keep it, keep your 5.9, and make your goals based on that. You know, like I said, there's no good or bad number. Now you know your number, and you can plan and make strategies based on where you're at today. If you thought that was dense, I just wanted to show this. I saw this a couple weeks ago. This is the most densely populated island in the world. This is Santa Cruz del Isolet in Colombia. I apologize for murdering that. But 1,200 people live on this island, and 18 trees live on this island. You know, this is an island on an archipelago, and these folks work on bigger islands that are resort islands. And this island was attractive because apparently mosquitoes don't flock here. And that's a big deal when you are living in a part of the world where mosquito-borne illnesses are a problem, right? So you put up with your neighbors just to stay safe and healthy. And that's something we can all appreciate in the times of COVID, right? So how does your city compare? Well, Rob gave me a list of folks that registered for this, so hopefully you guys get to see your cities. I picked 6 at somewhat random to show this. Miami Gardens, if you're here, you have 19.39%. Good for you. Keep it up and see if you can manage with that number in mind. Largo, you have 24.6% canopy coverage. And when I say this, we excluded all bodies of water. And so like big lakes, you can't have a tree there, right? So we excluded water from our assessment, but otherwise we just said tree or no tree when we were marking our aerial images. Key West, 26.9%. St. Petersburg, 34.1%. Titusville, 41.7%. And that was the highest out of the pre-registrants that we had was Titusville. Congratulations to you when camping around there. So maybe you have some natural areas beyond where I was at. Keep in mind, I know that some of you have done iTree analyses and canopy analyses on your own time, right? And you might have a different number than what we have. And that's okay, because there are things that will influence our values. Also keep in mind that it's just a number, it's not good or bad. So if you have 5.9% canopy and you can only have 8% given the land you have available for growing trees, you're doing pretty good, right? So don't feel like it's a competition between cities. A little friendly competition is good, you know, but we're not all playing on the same playing field with our densities. And even our historic land cover. You know, if you're a city that was built out of the Everglades, that's different than the city that was built out of a forest, right? And what you have for pre-settlement vegetation that could possibly be still in your city. Also, you know, if you have different values than what we've seen, than what we came up with, we might have different city boundaries. And that comes up when you're clipping around coastlines. Things get really kind of messy. And then we have different land classifications. So, you know, you can have different ground covers and stuff that could kind of throw off a little bit what you're looking at. If you have a shrub ground cover or a grassland ground cover that you're trying to like discern from a tree ground cover. So those things come up. And then just different assessors. We had students who, by the end of it, were pretty well trained, but where they are on the curve and where your city was on that curve of learning can impact things. But we did have cross-validation in our samples with trained assessors, my PhD student Deb and Drew McLean, my former land manager. So we do know our error rates. We will publish those with these. So To the research question, are local laws currently in place that'll, and are the ones that are in place actually impacting canopy coverage? And I'm still in the data analysis phase for this. I did some preliminary statistics for the sake of this talk, but some of the things that we need to do to get rid of some of the background noise are pretty intensive, and we will be working on that for the better part of the next 2 months. So, but I wanted to give you a little taste of what's to come. So, private oversight. Just putting two box plots up next to each other of cities that had permits on private property prior to this passage of the new state statute versus ones that had no permitting and no regulation of private trees. You can see here that when you just put everything against each other, there's no difference in canopy coverage. And I've done enough statistics where I don't think that this is going to tease out when we start accounting for other things in the model. I think that this is going to be pretty static, honestly. So maybe it's not all doom and gloom. Maybe what we really need to do is focus on what a lot of you know is a big issue, which is development and how to, and if we can tighten up the language in a revision of this law so that trees on undeveloped lots are no longer included by some folks, we can take care of a lot of the problems, hopefully. And I'm sure you all have examples of a big tree on an existing property that was cut down just because people hated trees and had a bad day, but on a larger scale, we won't hopefully see that. Heritage tree ordinances. So again, just like our previous study, we do see a difference. These are confidence error bars. So if there's any overlap whatsoever in those error bars, they are not statistically different. So I put other confidence error bars, they're easy to interpret. You can see here that they are not separate at this coarse level. I would suspect as we start to clean up some of the background noise that is like density of housing and things like that, and maybe housing value and things like that, this will separate out a little bit more and it'll become significant. I'm not sure, but that's my suspicion based on my experience as a model builder. So speaking of model building, I love stats. Like that's, it's a sickness, honestly. But when we do these statistical models, we try to figure what the signal is in the noise. And Nate Silver was a famous statistician who kind of worked in baseball statistics at first and sports statistics, made a name for himself, predicted a couple of elections right, predicted the last one, the presidential one, wrong. But that's just, that threw everyone for a loop, right? But so when we do this model, our signals of interest are these ordinances because we frame this original project based on the new statute. The noise that we need to control for, which is going to take a while for us to get this information, this data, is historic land cover. Have we built into the Everglades? Have we built into the pine barrens? Or pine forests? What does that mean for the current urban forest, that history, right? The age of the city. A city that was built within the last decade is going to have a lot smaller canopy than a city that has been around for the past 40 years, just because of the effect of time and people plant trees once they have a new house, right? Housing density, demographics, someone mentioned in the comments that race plays into canopy coverage all too often. More often than not, money plays into that as well. Richer people just tend to have more trees, in their neighborhoods. It's just a correlation. It's not a cause or effect, it probably is, but we can't tell what it is. Hurricanes, we have wind maps for the past 20 years or so, where we are looking at the wind fields and recording the peak gust winds and the max sustained winds that every city kind of experienced within the last 20 years. So that's like Dorian, Michael, Irma. Somebody actually, it's probably 10 years. I misspoke there, sorry. And that's where we have the best data for it. And because hurricanes clean out a lot of trees that are just kind of holding on. Annexation in natural areas. we're going to use census blocks and just focus on the neighborhoods that actually have an urban population when we actually do this analysis, because we'll do it both ways. We'll do it with the natural areas in, but we'll also filter out the natural areas so that we can see the true effect of the law itself. And then pests and diseases, things like the termites down in the south, bay wilt, all these different things, lethal bronzing. How are they affecting our canopies, and can we quantify that? I suspect a lot of the trees that we've been losing are palms and lower canopy trees, so that may not be a big issue, but we will look into it. So ecosystem services. In addition to giving you a number of your canopy, we're following the iTree canopy model. Even though we did this in our own GIS, my former lab manager backed out the model from iTree, and we're able to give you ecosystem service estimates for 3 key services in your urban areas. So as a refresher, trees give us beauty, which should not be diminished. That is the number one reason why people plant trees, is for the aesthetic appeal, and surveys show that time and time again, so we can't ignore that. But trees give us beauty, shading and cooling. They enhance our property value. Jeff Donovan and Sean Landry showed that property prices for home sales in Tampa actually increased as you increase tree canopy coverage, beyond the other things like bedrooms and stuff that are important. Energy savings. There's a study, I got to find it, but trees will help you save on cooling as long as you don't have kids. If you have kids, they will just open and close that door all day long, all summer long, and just ruin any savings that a tree would give you. So improving air quality, stormwater attenuation, biodiversity and habitat, as Rob was talking about, and a lot of other things such as carbon storage. So we did a statewide assessment. We did it for the 300 largest cities, but we also did the metro areas. So there's 29 metropolitan and micropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas are big. Micropolitan areas are distinct small areas, kind of like Sebring, if you know where that is. And the Key West is a micropolitan area. It's like a self-contained economic hub of a certain size. So we did that, and we found that for the entire state, with this iTree canopy model, we're saving $605 million in healthcare costs, most related to lung health from the filtration of pollutants and particulates. We attenuated or mitigated 75,000 Olympic swimming pools worth of water, that could have been sent right through stormwater systems and overrun some of our combined sewage systems, such as happened in like St. Pete and other places in the past, right? And we sequestered 65 million tons of CO2 and CO2 equivalents in a year, which is the same as the CO2 emitted from 15 coal power plants, or 6.8 million houses, or 6.7 billion cars. I show you the map of metro areas to show that these areas include a lot of ex-urban lands, like a lot of forests that's beyond the city. So when you look at the national estimates of benefits that NOAC does, we are a big chunk of that when we look at this broader spectrum. He's very tight and focused on the urban areas himself. So just to give you that. And the model accounts for that. We have mixed land use types. They have different values for urban areas and rural areas. So Jacksonville, if you're on the line, these are some preliminary numbers, and they may change. You're working in a scale of numbers that is beyond my normal capacity when I work with DBHs and stuff. So, but Jacksonville, population of 900,000. The city itself is the entire county of Duval County. And if you look at the health benefits, in a given year, I actually used both because, and I need to find a good definition for this. It includes both rural and urban in the model. You have 14,000 tons of air pollution mitigated, and that's $32.8 million in healthcare costs. So related to lung health. Hollywood, Florida, are you on the call? If so, And these were just kind of picked at random, different sizes based on people who registered, and I just kind of randomly picked. Population of 150,000, mid-sized city in the southeast by Fort Lauderdale. You have stormwater mitigation, and I used urban for this. Like I said, I need to really nail down the rule that I'm going to use in the future. But 136 million gallons of water attenuated, and that's about the same as 206 Olympic-sized swimming pools, which is quite a bit. And then Wildwood, going to the smaller side of our populations. So Wildwood, I see your population as 6,709. Wildwood is by the villages in Sumter County. And given your acreage and your canopy coverage, we estimate that you sequester annually 15,000 tons of carbon, which is the same as would be offset from the carbon emissions of 453 homes, or nearly 500,000 cars, and that's your forest right there. This is a very preliminary kind of mock-up of a dashboard. This is something that a non-designer GIS specialist that I work with, Amr, put together based on what Esri can do, just on their web portal functionality. But we'll have something like this, which will be a portal where you can see your city boundary, the benefits that you have. They'll be able to report on the side. And then we'll have that infographic with your benefits on there that you'll be able to download for use in like signatures and emails, on your websites, all sorts of things. So you can show your citizens what their urban forest is doing for them at its current state. The website will, again, be an overview of the pre-163.45 canopy coverage. So like pre-law, this is 2018 imagery. Included and archived on this website, we will have the infographic for your use and download. We will have the GIS boundary that we used, because I said, if you have different clipping for your water areas and things like that, it'll throw off your acreage. So you'll have that. We will give you the air pollution benefits. Oh, sorry. We'll give you the point layers that we used, because if you generate a new random one, you could be off just a little bit just by random chance. And we'll give you the clipped ortho photos that we use, because these come in big images and they take up a lot of space. So we'll give you the clipped one that we use if you want to look at what we looked at. You don't need to, but we'll give you that as a record. We also will give you the original interpretations that we came up with, as well as our cross validations of the 10% that we redid, so that you can see, maybe even train to what we've done, if you wanted to. And this website will also house all the reports, papers, slide sets, and presentations such as this that we do for the project. How can you use this? I think first is you now have a measure of where your canopy coverage is and some of the benefits, and that allows for discussion. These benefit models are broad course estimates of the value of your urban forest in a specific mindset with those three benefits in mind. But it gives you a scale that you can start to talk to other people and say, okay, this is, given the city budget and what we spend on roads and parks and schools, what's the value of the urban forest in relationship with those big ticket items, right? It allows you to set meaningful canopy goals. If you're at 5.9%, maybe shoot for 6.5, but you may never get to that 20 or 30%, but you can set meaningful goals for you. And if it's no net canopy loss, maybe that's sufficient. Maybe you're happy with what you have now. And that's something that a conversation with your decision makers and your community will kind of elicit what is a goal worth having. You can track the impacts of your policies management. I hope that we will be able to do this again in 5 or 10 years as the follow-up for this question. We'll have the funding to do that, I hope. If not, you can do it for your own community because we give you all the files to do it yourself. And then when you've done it, when you've seen how your canopy has changed or not changed, you can adjust as needed your policies and procedures and management activities to meet or your existing goal, to adjust to meet the goal, or to meet the new goal that you have. There's some folks that are not represented by a city here. There's some folks from other countries. What can you do if you're not one of the 300 cities that we included in our study? Well, like I said before, iTree Canopy is a very user-friendly tool that allows you to, I would say the course of a half a day to, it depends on how fast you go, a half a day to a day, you could get the canopy assessment for your city or your community college or your military base or your HOA, right? So, and like I said, they have a lot of these shape files in place. I was able to find an unincorporated town in Florida as part of an existing boundary to do an assessment for Ruskin, Florida, where my kids go to school. So, and just like our dashboard, they give you a pretty good report, so this is showing you the different layers that they have. So, we did tree or no tree. They have a ton of different things like bare soil and bare ground versus impervious ground, things like that, which is cool. Because if you have like grass and herbaceous and soil and bare ground, what your capacity for increasing trees are. So that's something that we could be doing. They also give you the tree benefits that we had given you in a report. Again, we just kind of backed out their model so that we could use it with our system, which was using our GIS. So we could pick the imagery dates that we had. So the question is, where do we go from here? I have two thoughts. We have a little bit of budget left to explore some new questions. And maybe we can do both. Maybe we can only do one. But one would be to go back to those metro areas and look at historic imagery from going back as far as we can get, maybe even post World War II, to kind of get a timeline of canopy loss in the state as it went from, kind of a sleepy state to the third largest state that is today, right? And then, so that's kind of the backward kind of trajectory showing us where we've come and kind of allowing us to hopefully see where we may be going. But something that maybe is even more meaningful to the future of our urban forest is, what is our potential for urban canopy given the current zoning laws? Because the urban forest that we have now is a product of past management, past decisions, past zonings. We have vastly different zoning laws than probably even post-war, right? So in these highly compact developments with infill developments and really compact greenfield developments, what is our potential for urban forest? Have we peaked? Given our current boundaries, we may never be able to get what we have long term to the same level anymore. So that's another thing that we're interested in. With that, I thank you very much for your time. We are going to be working within the next month and a half to we have all the canopy numbers done, right? I want to do the ecosystem services, and we'll be able to pass it out to everyone who wants some. But I want to have some quality control and make sure that someone checks those numbers, because again, they're on a scale that I don't normally work with, and we don't want to make any errors with that. So we're going to take our time with the ecosystem services, but we will have them out within probably the next 6 to 8 weeks, and we'll be able to pass it on to you. So, and then within the next 8 months, we will have that website done and ready to go, where everything will be housed. So again, I want to give a shout out to the Florida Forest Service and the Center for Land Use Efficiency at University of Florida for the funds for this work. I want to thank former lab manager Drew McLean, and Deb Hilbert, my PhD candidate, and Hunter Thorne, my full-timers, for their work on this. And then we have a whole slew of academics who are kind of just collaborating on this. So It's work at the University of Florida, University of South Florida, um, you know, University of Wisconsin, and Florida Forest Service. It's a really big joint effort here. So thank you very much.
Andrew, you want to take the questions? Open them up.
Sure, let me stop my share. Let me get a drink of water. That's more than I normally talk. Okay. Thank you both. Okay, so questions. We have 8 questions, it looks like. The first question was from Kay, and she wanted to know what was the name of that preserve. You showed that picture where there's a development on the top and then a preserve on the bottom. Do you know what that preserve was called?
No.
No. It's the anonymous preserve. So that's an easy one. Okay, next question. Rob, how can monitoring the urban forest promote sustainable management? And are there standard criteria for measuring urban forest canopy?
Well, I'll take the first part because unless we monitor our management actions, and that includes policy and planning in the whole 9 yards, not just the technical side of things that foresters and biologists and arborists get involved in. Unless we actually monitor the outcomes of our actions, we can never be assured that we are getting the outcome that we are trying to achieve. And I think this is particularly true in our world today as the population is growing so rapidly. These these city municipal systems are expanding into metropolitan regions. It's really changing the dynamics of the forests, both inside the municipality and outside, and also and lots of times, we're looking now at these ecological relationships, and Andrew alluded to this a little bit in the talk before, but I know that a lot of people who are with us today are looking at these ecosystem services and goods that Dave Nowak's models are showing us, which are just some of them. That's just really a small set, really, that we can measure at this point. But we need to be asking ourselves, what is happening to those goods and services over time, and looking at cause and effect. That's the big thing that Andrew is giving us today, is he's beginning to give you baseline data to begin to judge cause and effect. Did that policy cause something to happen? Do these management actions cause something to happen? Can we see trends in the forest over long periods of time based upon the planning that is typically done by a city over time? So that's why monitoring is really important. We really can't be assured that what we're doing is good or bad unless we actually take the time to measure it and to watch it change over time.
And to that point, as for urban forest monitoring on the ground, the Forest Service, Laura Roman, Laura, if you're on here, she put together standards for on the ground monitoring. There are some technical documents out there from the Forest Service for canopy assessment if you're doing a dot approach like you're doing. Mostly it comes down to how many dots you're going to use, what are you going to do for cross validation. It's pretty simple, but there are some things that you should consider before you get into this.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. It's always good, folks, to get for some kind of a geographer and statistician to be looking at how you do this. The technique itself is a very old technique. Look at me. I've been using it for 40 years, just not using it with a computer. It's just a series, it's random dots across an area, and with the help of a statistician and a geographer, you can figure out how many dots for the area that you're looking at that you need to come up with a statistically valid description of what you're measuring.
Yeah, and Naomi writes, more of a comment that if we want to have people understand the value of structure and function of the forest and the ecosystem services, we need to have these conversations in a manner with the other professionals that they can understand. And that's a point well taken. Naomi also writes, are you assessing only canopy coverage, or are you using iTree Eco for any portion of the canopy to get a better assessment of the ecosystem services? We are only using canopy for this because 300 cities is a lot. When we do Tampa, it's a whole year, and I'd say half of it is just getting permission to get on property. It's like when you're doing an assessment on private property and public property, public's really easy, of course, but the private is just multiple visits. You probably get a plot a day just because of trying to get permissions, and once, as you send out flyers and you get all the people that responded, there's the non-response, you get the track down. So it's quite daunting, and to do that at the scale that we did for the state would be that'd be a career. So
I think it's important to recognize that what Andrew was describing was a first step, and it's a valid first step, and it provides important information that we can use, but it certainly does not provide the level of detail that will be needed to make reasonable decisions about the conservation of the diversity of the forest, its plants and animals, and the functionality of the hydrologic systems. These are going to be very, very important. And this is why I mentioned earlier that this is the first step in building cooperation and collaboration. One of the first things that you can do is to create a common data set, something that we can all share and we can all talk to at the same time. And that's what this project is doing. It's also providing an opportunity to see how that canopy is changing over time based upon, in this case, we believe, primarily development patterns.
Very good. Is there a source that can be assessed to learn tree canopy in a county? So if you want to do a county, and maybe we'll do this. I kind of feel like that was a missed opportunity. But if you want to do your own county, what you would probably want to do is you can either do the whole county or just the unincorporated areas if you're looking at it from the county management perspective. And that would take some finding, but I'm sure the county has that somewhere. And then you could do the iTree assessment on your own, and like in a day you would figure out what your county has. The next question is, our city's tree preservation ordinance requires developers to remove invasive species such as Australian pines, Brazilian peppers, etc. We also don't require replacement of these trees. What are your thoughts on this? Is canopy worth the, okay, so what are your thoughts on removing invasive species? So I feel that when we did the ecosystem assessment of Tampa, which is the iTree Eco, we included Brazilian pepper and Australian pines and all these things in our models for the ecosystem services because they're producing benefits, and that raised the ire of some of the naturalist groups. But these trees are doing it, and they're doing it really well because they don't require any kind of maintenance and requirements, But those ecological services like carbon sequestration and stormwater mitigation are just part of the bigger picture. If you're worried about biodiversity, if you're worried about all these other things, the functioning of the ecosystem, and Rob can talk to this, it's a balance between the net positives and the net negatives. And that's a value statement, really. I would say that most people on a whole would say they're doing more harm than good, but they are doing good. They are, so I don't know about not requiring it. I think a lot of that comes with developers don't want to spend money on a tree that is on a noxious list. So if if they're being required to mitigate a tree that you didn't want there in the first place, that raises red flags in the development community. So Hollywood is in our study. As you saw in the slides, have we evaluated the ecosystem disservices of the urban forest? Not yet. We're trying to get people on Team Trees at the moment, but that is a very good point. You know, trees they do harm, and if we avoid talking about some of the things that they do wrong, like lift sidewalks and things like that, we don't have a true picture of the net benefits that trees give us. You know, and you want to maximize net benefits by maximizing ecosystem services and minimizing disservices through proper planting, care, and maintenance.
Andrew,
I'll let you
I'd like to
take
address that just for a second.
Yeah, yeah.
What Andrew said is absolutely true, but we're going to do something very shortly about the problem that we have with the language we're using. Trees, municipal forests, urban forests, these are all being used often interchangeably, and they're not. They're not interchangeable. So the urban forest or trees, if you will, in highly developed, engineered, what I like to call sanitary city conditions, have one set of disservices for sure, because they interrupt and damage those engineered structures. That's primarily what we look at when we look at disservices. Outside of that municipal core, that city core, the ecological disservices of the forest go way down, okay? And so today, we are beginning to talk about the true urban forest of Florida, the emerging urban forest of Florida. And so we will look at the services as they come up, but I think the project itself is an expansive one that is looking at the land area, the landscape of the entire state. Andrew?
Yeah, no, I agree. And then, you know, a couple people had, oh, here's one, an arborist. I am an arborist and would like to ask if you have thoughts about insurance versus risk of canopy over roofs. This is some research we're doing right now, actually, and it's looking at hurricane data to see if there's a protective effect of other trees around trees and other structures and buildings around trees. Because I've heard folks say that a tree over a house will protect the roof, and the house next to a tree will protect the tree, and vice versa. And when they're separate, they don't have the protection. But we're not really seeing that in either of our two data sets that we have now. I will say that in all the storms I've assessed lately, and it's been maybe 5 data sets from hurricanes, you know, tree failures are really rare, relatively rare. Whole tree failures are like 1% of the population, and branch failures are maybe 20%, you know, in category 1 and 2 storms. So I think that the insurance people have data that supports their reasons and their rationales for having you remove trees and prune trees before you get coverage. But I think they're missing that most trees don't, because they have claims data, right? It's like they know when a tree hits a house. They don't know how many trees, I would say, aren't hitting the house, you know, unless they are collecting that data too. So, and then Naomi wrote back that, you know, the fact that we're not, you know, things, your canopy analysis won't pick up invasives, so maybe there is merit to doing some ground-based stuff as well. We agree. That's why when we work with Tampa, we do a 2-prong approach with both the ground-based and the canopy. But this is a lot of bang for your buck doing a canopy analysis. Like, I think that every city can do this in the course of a day or two and get some really useful information. Not as good as having like a full eco study, but it's still very useful, and it's useful for making statewide decisions regarding policy. So,
Yeah, Andrew, it's one metric, and all of us who deal with forest ecology recognize that there are many metrics, but it is one metric, and it's the first time in this state that metric has been explored. And so what we're hoping is, as we found in Tampa, that once you begin to create data and data sets that have some validity, that these data sets continue to act like little pieces of candy for scientists. And they will want to come to Florida, and they will want to come to continue this conversation and to keep working and to create new technologies and new insights that we can share to create a more definitive and healthy future for our children and for the people who live here, and to provide some opportunity to share what we've learned about how we do these things with other people in other parts of the world. Again, that whole idea of monitoring what we're doing it ourselves. We're monitoring, we're adjusting, and we're sharing it.
And one last point that I want to hit is we mentioned a urban forestry working group, and Rob and I will be revitalizing that, recognizing that Zoom is really effective at having these kind of conversations, especially when we open it up to people. So look forward to that for the Tampa Bay folks and the central West Florida. And for folks in other parts of the state, like I think there's value in getting together, and we can help facilitate this, and your extension agents can help facilitate this, in getting together in your regional areas and discussing urban forestry just informally every other month or so, like what's going on in Southeast Florida. They do this in other parts of the world. When I was in Chicago, they had a group like this, and you can talk about things like the termites and stuff like that you're finding. Just have these informal dialogues, and we're going to try to facilitate more of that, kind of like this, in the future. So
that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you all who made it this far. Mark has a question. I'll answer quickly. I'll just type you an answer. And then for the rest of you, thank you very much for your time and attention. And we will get the recording up as soon as we can. And I will send out the slide sets to Rob. And if he wants to send them off, I don't know what you want to do with those, Rob, but people have been asking for them. So
we'll see.
Okay, we'll see. You can just email me specifically if you want them. How's that?
Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Take care.
Good to be with you. Bye-bye.